All right, let's go to chapter 3 of Frog and Toad Are Friends. Now, this chapter is called A Lost Button. Remember what we talked about yesterday? Good readers always ask questions. Who, what, when, where, how, and why. Today we are going to be asking a lot of how questions. Okay, so this chapter is called A Lost Button. Toad and Frog went for a long walk. They walked across a large meadow. What's a meadow? What is a meadow? That's a what question I'm asking myself while I read. And I'm trying to think if I have ever seen a meadow. A meadow is a big field that has a lot of grass and flowers. So I think I've seen some meadows before. They walked in the woods, they walked along the river. At last, they went back home to Toad's house. When I read that, it makes me think of all of the rivers and forests that I have seen and been through. "Oh, drat!" said Toad. "Not only do my feet hurt, but I have lost a button. I have lost one of my buttons on my jacket." "Don't worry," said Frog. "We will go back to all the places where we walked. We will soon find your button." They walked back to the large meadow. They began to look for the button in the tall grass. "Here's your button!" cried Frog. "That's not my button," said Toad. "That button is black. My button is white." Toad put the black button in his pocket. So how did Toad know that that wasn't his button? He knows what his button looks like. His button is white. And Frog is really trying to help, but he picked a black button. A sparrow flew down. "Excuse me," said the sparrow. Did you lose a button?" "I found one." "That's not my button," said Toad. "That button has 2 holes. My button had 4 holes." Toad put the button with 2 holes back in his pocket. All right, so the sparrow found a button with only 2 holes, but Frog's button is white with 4 holes. They went back to the woods and looked on the dark paths. "Here's your button," said Frog. "That's not my button," said Toad. "That button is small, very small. My button was big." Toad put the small button in his pocket. I wonder why he put the button in his pocket. A raccoon came from behind a tree and heard that you were looking for a button, he said. "Here's one that I just found." "That's not my button," wailed Toad. "That button is square. My button is round." Toad put the square button in his pocket. Frog and Toad went back to the river. They looked for the button in the mud. "Here's your button," said Frog. "That is not my button," shouted Toad. "That button is thin. My button is thick." Wow, listen to all the words that they are using to describe Toad's button. His button is not black, it's white. It does not have 2 holes, it has 4. It is not square, it is circle. It is not small, it is big. And it is not thin, it is thick. Toad put the thin button in his pocket. He was very angry. He jumped up and down and screamed, "This whole world is covered with buttons, and not one of them is mine!" Toad ran home and slammed the door. There, on the floor, was his white, four-holed, big, round, thick button. "Oh," said Toad, "it was here the whole time. What a lot of trouble I have made for Frog." You see his little button right there on the floor? He made Frog go through a lot of trouble to help him find his button. Toad took all the buttons out of his pocket. Good thing he collected those buttons. He took his sewing box down from the shelf. Toad sewed his buttons all over his jacket. Look, he's got buttons all over his jacket. The next day, Toad gave his jacket to Frog. Frog thought it was beautiful. He put it on and jumped for joy. None of these buttons fell off. Toad had sewn them on very well. And that is the end of chapter 3. So now what I want for you to do, I want for you to take a piece of paper. I want you to take a piece of paper and you're going to fold it in half and then fold it in half again. You should have 4 sections. Okay? And when you open it up, the paper is going to be divided into fourths. 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4. Okay? 1, 2, 3, 4. Now for each section, you are going to draw what Frog's button or what Toad's button looked like. Okay? You're going to draw what the button looks like in each section. I drew lines on my folds. Okay? You can do that too. In one section, you're going to write tall grass. Remember, you can pause this video if you need to write. Tall grass, sparrow, raccoon, and mud. Now you are going to draw a picture of all of the buttons that they found in here. So let's go back to the story. Do you remember what button looked like that they found in the tall grass? That button was black. So you would draw a black button. You would draw a black button. Yours is going to look a lot better than mine. Do you remember what they found, what the sparrow found for them? Let's look. The sparrow flew down. Did you lose a button? That's not my button. That button has 2 holes. Mine has 4. You will draw a button with only 2 holes because that is the button that the sparrow found. Now we're going to go to the raccoon. Remember what the raccoon found? That's not my button. That button is square. My button is round. So let's draw a square button. All right, you should draw a square button. And then in the mud, do you remember what button they found in the mud? Here's your button. That's not my button. That button is thin. My button is thick. So you're going to try to draw a really thin button, which is going to be really difficult to do, but you're going to try your best. Here's my really, really thin button that they found in the mud. When you're done doing this, you're going to flip it over. You're going to flip your paper over, and you are going to write Toad's Toad's button. And you are going to draw a picture of what Toad's button looked like. Do you remember what it looked like? It was white, had 4 holes, circle, and it was big and thick. Okay? So draw the best button that you can of Toad's, okay? And then you're going to write one sentence about how you knew, how Toad knew that it wasn't his button all those times. So, for example, Toad had to know what his button looked like, right? And he compared it to all of the other buttons that he found. Okay, go ahead and try to write one complete sentence about how Toad knew that all those other buttons were not his button.